Kubernetes for Humans.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Kubernetes for Human podcast. Today, with me in the show, we have Cory. Cory, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Cory O'Daniel. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Massdriver. We're an infrastructure automation tool, and I'm also the host of the Platform Engineering podcast. Thanks for having me on.
That's great. It's like a crossover episode.
Heck yeah! I was gonna say, when are you coming on? When are you guys coming on the Platform Engineering podcast?
We will come, and I'll come with, I just bought a new microphone. So if people hear and first time, they hear me clearly, it's thanks to another person that recommended me this microphone. But Cory, CEO of infrastructure company, automation, right? Tell us a bit about your background. I guess that you didn't start. This is your first step, right? So,
Yeah.
Sure.
So-
What's your story?
Yeah, I've been in the space for quite a while. So I'm a software engineer. The frequent joke is the E in my title, and apologies if it's echoey. I'm in our office today, so I'm not on my good audio. Yeah, I'm a software engineer. The joke is around the opposite is the E in my title is Chief Elixir Officer. So we program a lot in Elixir and Golang. But I've been, working in cloud operations since 2005, and before that, I was working in data centers. My master's is in healthcare information systems. So late 90s, early 2000s, around the era HIPAA being rolled out in the US, was kind of when I was getting my feet wet in operations. And so I moved to California in 2005, I think 2005. I'm not really good with time. I think it was about 2005, to join a startup. I'd worked for a bunch of big companies before I go to California, work in a startup, wear board shorts to work, all the cool stuff. And my very first job, I also kind of switched from the ops side to the development side. And so I'm in the office one day and my boss comes by and he's like, "You've worked in a data center before, right?" And I'm like, "Yep." He's cool. And then he just walks away. And I was like, "Oh, all right." That was an interesting conversation. And 2 hours later, an email goes out to the entire operations team and the entire software development team. It's 30 or 40 people. And he's like, "Hey, our lease is expiring on our data center, and Amazon," I don't know if anybody's familiar with Amazon. They're a book company. They're selling these cloud computers. I think I don't think he said VM. I'm pretty sure he said cloud computer or something. He said something really goofy. And he's like, and Cory's going to lead the migration since he's worked in software and operations. And so I'm just like, oh, there's board. I have no idea I'm leading this thing. I'm like, I guess I'm leading a data center migration to AWS. So I just kind of got heaved into the cloud unexpectedly in my very first role, and then kind of got pigeonholed into a DevOps engineer or the next piece or so.
People can't really see it here, but there's a lot of air quotes going around. But yeah, both around the cloud and DevOps and so on. I completely understand. Yeah, carry on.
And so, yes, I've been in this air quotes DevOps role for most of my life. As a matter of fact, yesterday, as a CEO, I was doing Fluent deconfig. That's what you do as a CEO, people. You're still dealing with logs. Yeah. So from there, I started my first startup in 2008. It was a smashing success, and by that I mean it went out of business. And then, I proceeded to join a few different startups, started a few of my own for a couple of years. And then in 2016 or 2017, I can't really recall exactly when it was, I've got this niche expertise, which is Erlang and Elixir, Erlang, Beam VM, and Kubernetes. And there was a point in time where if you search for Kubernetes, Erlang, or Kubernetes, Elixir, I just showed up as the first search result. It was just me there. And I managed the Kubernetes client for Elixir. I built the extension framework. So I built the operator framework for Kubernetes in Elixir. So you can actually extend Kubernetes with Elixir. So I was the thing that showed up, and Google had just secured this contract for a really big cloud migration, 9 physical data centers to the Google Cloud. And the company was Erlang based. and they were planning to move from VMs and,
Who is Erlang based? Like, I think a lot of my listeners don't really know Erlang because, it is like a niche hipster language that was invented by Bell, I don't know, like in the 80s or something like that. Something rare. So, like you do need to give us like 1 minute on Erlang, who, why. WhatsApp was written in Erlang, right? Like it's like a telecom hardcore programming. Like you tell it because I'm not. After seeing the hello world in Erlang, I was like, I'm never going to be like an Erlang developer. It's not for me. And it was like one of the mindfuck sessions that I had in my like I think all of my career. So yeah, if you can, like 2-3 minutes on Erlang.
Yeah, and I got introduced to Erlang in like 2010 in a very weird database that a company I worked at like built in-house database, and it was written in Erlang. But Erlang, if anybody who's listening has used Heroku, you've actually run on Erlang as well. There's a good amount of Heroku's like routing layer that's built in Erlang. And so Erlang was built by Ericsson, old cell phone company in the 90s. You maybe heard of Ericsson, in the US at least. I don't know if they're still big elsewhere, but it's a functional programming language. But it's a bit more than a language. So there's this protocol, OTP, the Open Talking Protocol. Somebody's gonna be mad that I totally messed that up. I'm not good with acronyms. But the idea is it's functional programming language, has its own VM, and it is designed to be extremely concurrent and fault tolerant, right? If you think about where the phone system is, right? Like you need to be able to, you can't call everybody on the planet and be like, hey, we're taking the phones down for 30 minutes while we like upgrade the software. So Erlang itself, you can actually network the nodes pretty transparently. You can update, it's a compiled language, you can update the bytecode live. So you can actually like push stuff in. You can do remote procedure calls like between the programming language itself. And there's even like built-in SQL-esque servers, key value stores. So you can actually have an application that runs. And I've got a couple different blog posts and talks on Erlang and Elixir as well. They're very similar. Erlang, Elixir, the whole Beam, there's a bunch of language in the Beam ecosystem. But I wrote a blog post a few years ago called From Serverless to Elixir that talks through how like we went from Lambda to Elixir and how it saves a ton of money. And I got another talk called the Beam and Kubernetes better together. And so that one's actually pretty interesting if you're familiar with Kubernetes. I kind of talk through the fault tolerance and the features of this programming language that overlap with Kubernetes. And so this is one of the hard parts when you're coming into Kubernetes from Erlang is you're like, where does the fault tolerance and like DevOps of this programming language is extremely powerful end, and where does operations begin, right? So you can take, if you look at companies like WhatsApp, like they're famous for like, they had like 3 VMs that all of WhatsApp was running on, and it was running on these insane Erlang nodes, and you can have databases in memory that are moving around the cluster. So it's a pretty wild language. Erlang itself, like people see it and they think it's hard. I think that's shit on a lot because of the syntax. Elixir and Gleam are 2 other languages that run on top of the same VM, which is called the Beam. So if you want that like functionality, you can look towards Elixir and Gleam. But it's really funny. I feel like when people start playing with Elixir, they're like, oh, what's this Erlang thing underneath the interoperable? You can call Erlang libraries from Elixir. And then you start to play with Erlang and you're like, oh, this is pretty cool as well. The syntax is super bizarre, but it's one of those things like you get used to it in like a day or so. I think the concepts coming from, procedural or object-oriented languages is like the bigger hurdle for a lot of people that are coming out of universities where they haven't traditionally seen a lot of functional programming. But yeah, so I was like this top search result. And so Google, which is really, really funny, like somebody that was working on this project at Google, like Googled for Erlang Kubernetes, and like my ass just shows up like first search result. And so somebody emailed me and they're like, hey, we're migrating this company. Nobody like on this professional services team at Google has any experience with Erlang like whatsoever. There was at the time some like real hardcore interoperability issues between Erlang and Kubernetes. And so they're like, do you want to come in and help us do this migration? And I was like, yes. So I got to join Google for a while, and that's kind of where the idea for Massdriver came from. So I got to go in, I worked with this amazing team. There's like 40 operations engineers in this company that we helped migrate. There was about 12 people on the Google team that was doing the migration. And what was really interesting is like the operations people that were in these data centers, they weren't software developers. They weren't in this world of like DevOps where you like do a little bit of cloud automation. Like they managed switches and Linux and cables. Like they did like the hardware work, right? But now all of a sudden they were in the cloud. Like they're all junior Terraform engineers overnight, right? Like their experience still mattered, but like their job was drastically different. And when I left that contract, I felt almost like, good luck, everybody. Like really, we just changed their world over like 6 months, and they were like, enjoy the cloud and Kubernetes, and the contractors were all gone, and it was just up to them to kind of figure it out. And so, seeing this constant struggle of companies from startups to these large scale organizations, like you don't quite have a lot of cloud operations knowledge globally, like for all these software teams that are out there running on the cloud today. Like that, the number of people with cloud operations and administrative skills is declining year over year for the past 6 years. So the idea was start to build some software that helps operations engineers and DevOps engineers kind of scale themselves, let them like package up a lot of their practices and policies into a diagram that made it easy for their teams to kind of draw stuff. So yeah, and so here I am today. So started Massdriver about 3 years ago now. We just did an $8 million seed round last year, right before the entire world imploded. Mm-hmm. And so now we're just trying to get to that $1 billion IPO in the sky.
Yeah, no, sounds non-trivial, but super.
It's not. Or it is.
Super ambitious.
It's hard as fuck.
So maybe, tell us a bit, because I think I'm not sure if I completely understand that. Like what do you guys do? Like, I've done ops all my life, right? Like I use Datadog, I use Grafana, I use Prometheus on one hand, I use Chef, I use Ansible, I use whatever. On the other side, I use Kubernetes. Where do you guys fit in? Like, when do I need you? And like, what's the trend, right? Like,
yeah. So we're on the surface, we're an infrastructure automation platform. So it feels like something like Terraform Cloud. Actually, it doesn't feel like it. Behaves like a Terraform Cloud or a Spacelift or an M0. But the thing that's a bit different about our platform is it's visual. It's all based on infrastructure as code, but it's visual for your users. So the idea is your operations engineers are building Terraform modules, CloudFormation, Helm, like they're doing all this infrastructure as code stuff. But what's funny is like, as developers start using the cloud, like that infrastructure as code and the operations stuff starts to become developers' concerns, right? I build this module, maybe it deploys EKS or maybe it deploys Postgres. Do I want my developers who are building business value to go learn Terraform and monitoring and metrics and all this stuff to run RDS? Or do I want them to say, I need Postgres 16 and then let them get back to building features, right? Like that's what most companies want. They want their developers shipping value. But we have to build scalable, compliant, secure things, right? When you're looking at something like RDS, there's configuration of Postgres that developers care about. And then there's configuration that developers don't give a shit about, right? Like, how many zones is it running in? How many replicas does it have? Developer doesn't really care as long as it works. It doesn't page them at 2 a.m., right? But your operations team absolutely cares about how many zones it in. Like, what's our disaster recovery plan? What does backups look like? Does this thing make sense cost-wise versus like running RDS non-Aurora or running our own like VM with Postgres on it, right? Like there's a bunch of concerns that are ops related, a bunch of concerns that are dev related, and they're all in the same API endpoint, right? And so you're looking at something like Terraform. There's a bunch of variables that developers care about. There's a bunch of variables that ops care about, but now it's in the plate of whoever's looking at that module. As a developer, I'm like, shit, like how many zones do I need? Let me go ask the ops people. Well, like, what's our practice for this? Okay, great. I did that. Now let me copy the module to my apps GitHub repo, and let me copy the CI/CD pipelines, and let me copy the checkoff and the policy as code. Like you're doing all this shit just to get Postgres 16, where locally as a developer, you're like, install Postgres and you're done, right? Like your world in dev is very different than your world in prod. And so what the platform is your operations engineers take infrastructure as code, Terraform, OpenTofu, or one of the companies behind OpenTofu, Helm, whatever tool it is, they write the code like they normally do, but we have this tool that packs their infrastructure as code and all of your policies together and makes this unit that we call a bundle. And now your engineers, when they go into Massdriver, when they need stuff, they just drag and drop. They literally diagram their infrastructure. And as they're diagramming it, it's provisioning and building the Terraform workspaces and all that stuff behind the scenes, doing all of the automation. It's building these ephemeral CI/CD pipelines that run like all of your policy as code. And so now as a developer, I can literally draw what I need for a new service. I can set just the fields I care about. And as the ops person, I know I gave you self-service, but I didn't have to worry about you picking the wrong zone config or the wrong encryption for RDS or the wrong backup rotation. Like I can enforce all of that and I can understand what you did, right? Like I'm like, oh shit, like something's down at 2 a.m. I can literally go in and I can see your infrastructure live. I can make a configuration. I can roll back changes from this diagram, and it's all real infrastructure as code and, GitOps behind the scenes.
That sounds ambitious and interesting, but let me challenge you, right? Like, and I'm sure that people like, Bedrock, sorry, and Backstage, one of its promises, it's around the templating, around dev empowerment, around like this service catalog that will enable your organization to take those DevOps practices and bake them into Backstage like templates. And then that's all we need. So if I'm using like Backstage, do I need you? Are you fighting? Are you friend? Maybe, and also what's your take either way on the Backstage ecosystem, which is becoming more and more like common and popular in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, Backstage is an interesting one. It's a tool built by a company for a scale of platform engineering that most people will never be at, right? And like the tools like Foundation was like, hey, we can't find shit, right? And they're kind of backing it into like, oh, it can manage the, right? But the reality is like a lot of these operations engineers, there's still a lot of people that do operations. They need to manage the cloud, but they're still not what you would consider like a traditional software developer. So all of a sudden heaving on their plate, like, hey, learn how to do TypeScript, learn how to do this, right? Like the whole idea with Massdriver was no one has to learn anything new. You write your Terraform, you publish it to Massdriver, mass bundle, publish it in Massdriver. Your developers don't have to learn Terraform. They don't have to learn about your CI. They don't have to learn about your policies code. They literally just draw shit. Like nobody has to learn anything new. But when you look at Backstage, like there's the pains of rolling out Backstage to the point that there's like 30 fucking clones of it now, right? And then you have to learn something new. The operations team can't use the infrastructure as code tooling that they want, right? So I think that we're solving kind of different problems, but I've honestly never really seen the value of something like Backstage. Now, if it's the thing that will now manage my infrastructure, okay, now you're starting to talk something I think is interesting and valuable. If it can manage infrastructure, if my developer can make a new microservice and the database and be able to understand how that stuff works together, and maybe I can get in there and see it. But if people have to learn new things, we don't have enough time to like learn another tool. Like we have so much stuff to do. Like developers, you only 40 hours a week. You got to build features. And operations teams, I don't know. We're all fucking underwater anyway, right? Like find me an ops person who's not drowning in debt while also trying to serve like 10 new business work streams at the same time, right? So our whole goal is like, we don't want either of these teams to incur more debt because they have to stop and learn how our thing works. And so our goal has always been like, we don't want to increase any sort of learning curve on either of these teams. So, I mean, we've gone head to head with like, oh, should we host Backstage ourselves or not? Funny enough, like we do have, I know one customer uses Massdriver for all their infrastructure and then they run Backstage on top of their clusters, which I think is funny. I know that we have a couple of customers that do that with people that we would consider, I'm not going to drop any names, but people that we would consider competitors. They use us for all the infrastructure management. And then essentially the Kubernetes stuff, like all their Kubernetes clusters, they have that company running the Kubernetes clusters. You know what I'm talking about. So I mean, I think it's an interesting tool. I think if it fits your team, that's great. But I think the more important thing, like looking at the ecosystem, there's a lot of Terraform automation vendors out there. There's Spacelip, M0, Harness, like we kind of fit in that space. There's all the IDPs that are out there, right? Whether it's portal or platform, like we kind of fit in that space too. I think the more important thing is none of these tools, Massdriver included, are the solution for everybody, right? And I think that's what's really key is there's a lot of these tools, especially when you start getting open source space, where they try to do everything under the sun. And it gets to the point where it's like, it does so much that you don't even know what to do with it, right? And I think that Backstage had a very good place like a year ago, but now it's starting to get to that place where it's like, well, what is this? What is this thing? Like, is it this thing that runs my, like deploys my infrastructure? Is it doing it with TypeScript, or do I make a TypeScript module that calls Terraform and I still do it with Terraform, right? Like, I think it's gotten to a place where it can overcomplicate. And since it's like the leader kind of in like the open source community, it's like, oh, that's the thing we should use. But the reality is like Massdriver might be the better fit for you. Spacelift might be the better fit for you. It really comes down to what your DevOps maturity level is, what your team makeup is, and how the fuck you even define DevOps, right? Like,
No, I think all are like, you hit it in the head, like, the complexity, the tools pearl, the no one size fit all on one hand. And, a lot of people will say that, you're saying that Backstage was developed by Spotify, which is true. To their use case, Kubernetes and Google is even more into the extreme in a way, right? Like taking these like, huge behemoth they develop internally to run your like 4 microservice doesn't necessarily makes a lot of sense. And I'm a big Kubernetes advocate. But let me ask you like another question, because I think it's very interesting talking about those underlying tools that support the infrastructure. What's your take on Crossplane? Like I see a lot of my customers that are telling me that they are now thinking about migrating to Crossplane, mainly because it is much more Kubernetes native. It allows you all of this state control plane. So what's your take on that? Should they move to Crossplane?
I don't know. So I actually have a talk from. Hold on, I'm gonna Google it really quick to see what. I don't know if it predates Crossplane, but I gave a talk. It's called Commandeering Kubernetes, and I gave it at the 2019. So I think Crossplane existed before 2019, but I hadn't heard of it. And so this talk was when I first started building the Kubernetes Elixir framework, so you could actually like write operators and schedulers using an Elixir instead of Golang. And in that talk, I pretty much show off like a homegrown Crossplane. So I'm showing you like, oh, you can actually like you can build these operators, and now I can have like a Postgres config that will actually provision on RDS alongside my Helm chart, right? And so like I was definitely interested in the idea at one point in time, but I think where it kind of jumps the shark is if you're a company that is 100% bought in on running your applications on Kubernetes, Crossplane is probably fantastic. And we support Crossplane, and nobody uses it on Massdriver. We support it, right? But I think the more important thing, the thing that kind of like gets to like chicken and egg with it is like when you look at companies that don't use Kubernetes across the board, it's like I don't think it makes sense for them at all. If I got a couple of things in Kubernetes and then I've got a whole suite of lambdas and step functions and I got some SAP stuff running on some VMs, if I have to write Kubernetes manifest to make these things that, I need to write a Kubernetes manifest to make a VM that's not in Kubernetes, or I have to write a Kubernetes manifest to deploy my Lambda, like I feel like we're really jumping the shark there, right? But if it's like, hey, all of our stuff, we're on OpenFast, like all of our workloads stay in Kubernetes, the entire team is just eating and breathing Kubernetes, great. But if that's not the case, it's like, okay, well, maybe that team that's doing a bunch of Lambda stuff, maybe they should use the serverless framework, right? Like that's the real rub. Is like I feel like we just do this time and time again. Like with teams, it's like, I'll actually give a really good example of this. We say like, oh, my team's like, hey, we are using this tool, and this company will use it. Be damned whether it fits or not. And we had this problem in platform engineering too. It's like, oh, we should build a platform. It's like, no, like there should be multiple platforms. You've got multiple teams that do things very differently, right? If you come in, you're like, hey, everybody is port here. And that's fucking it, right? Or everybody is going to use Dapper or whatever, and that's it. Well, I'll tell you what, you have a bunch of pissed off engineers. You might have some real great DevX for some of them. You got some real bad DevX for us. And like your teams are different. Organizations are different, right? We already talked about that, right? Orgs are different. There's going to be different tools, but you get into the teams. My front-end team doesn't use Massdriver, funny enough. They use Vercel. And I'm never going to take it away from them. Maybe one day we'll make a CDN integration so they can deploy to S3, but they like Vercel. Great. Everything else in Massdriver runs through Massdriver on AWS, right? Okay, that's cool. Look at a bigger organization. They've got a front-end team, they got a back-end team. They probably got multiple of these, but let's just say they have 3 teams: a front-end team, back-end team, and a data team. You're going to jam them all in the Backstage? I'll tell you what, that front-end team probably wants to use a Vercel or a flight control or something like that. That data team probably wants to use some new fancy data tool, but you're jamming them all into this one thing. And where I saw this like happen, where it was just like the shark was jumped, and then the shark jumped the person jumping the shark, and it was a stunt show. That company that helped do that migration, they decided to like, we're using Terraform. If you do anything in Google Cloud, you have to use Terraform. I'm working with the data team one day, and they're working on a BigQuery table. And they're like, this thing is really hard to do in Terraform. And I'm like, oh yeah, let me help you guys out. I've been using this Terraform thing forever. I look what they do. And they had a null resource in Terraform. They packaged the gcloud CLI command, and they were just using the gcloud CLI command. They were just executing it with Terraform. They were literally doing it in spite of the ops team. They're like, they said I have to use Terraform. We don't want to use Terraform. We just like using the gcloud thing. We'll just write a Terraform module that wraps the gcloud CLI command and manage our BigQuery tables. And I'm like, oh, like that's that. I feel like that's kind of like where we get a lot of times is like, you can't just come in and say, hey, everybody has to use this thing. And our philosophy with Massdriver is like platforms as cattle. Like in Massdriver, I can build a platform for a specific team using Terraform modules in a matter of minutes. Oh, you want to do stuff on Lambda? Great. I throw down some infrastructure. Your team has your infrastructure platform for Lambda. Great. You can clone it. You can make as many environments as you want. That team's happy. Oh my gosh, this team needs to run microservices. Design a platform that's Kubernetes based. Assign it to them. They can clone it, make staging prod, US West, EU, whatever. Data team wants to use, I don't know, maybe data team wants to use some new hot platform as a service for data. Great. Throw in the Terraform module, build them, put the provider in there, give it to them. Like now this whole team has the same UI, but different platforms. They have the same tool, but different IC mechanisms, different clouds that it runs on. You haven't forced anybody to start to use some technology that impacts the way that their application runs, right? And I think that's the hard part with a lot of what we do is it's so much easier for an ops team of 3 people to say, we're just going to use Kubernetes. But when you have a team of 150 developers doing things very different ways, because you've been in business for 7 or 8 years and you got debt and services all over the place, like falls apart. And it gets hard to move that initiative forward.
Okay, I don't think that we have a lot of time. So maybe I'll do like a bit like a wrapping question of asking you, and I think you mentioned it quite a lot here, but what's the future? Like for Massdrive in particular, but for the industry as a whole, like 3 years from now, we'll be talking what's going to happen, what's going to be different than today, like trends, cultural shift, whatever you like shoot.
Yeah, I think that we have gotten to a point where everything is way more complicated than it needs to be, right? Like there is, it's funny, like when you look at the cloud, AWS never had the goal of being simple or easy. They had the goal of being capable. They want to sell whatever type of compute to you that you need, right? And so when you sit down and look at AWS, and it's like, we see this all the time, customers are moving from like Heroku to AWS the first time. They're like, oh, there's 200 AWS services. Like, yeah, just use a VM, bro. Like, if you've been on Heroku, just deploy one VM. Like, just start there, throw an auto-scaling group on it. Like, don't get lost in the flurry of 200 services. But there's so many companies I've seen, it's like they come to AWS and like, oh, I have to use ECS. And they get way in over their head on the amount of like cloud sprawl they want. So I think you're seeing this a bit with like repatriation to data centers. Like you're seeing people start to talk about this. You saw the 37 signals move of Basecamp and Hey. I think we're going to see a resurgence of simplicity. And I think we're starting to see that. There is like 15 platforms as a service now. There's a platform as a service from every way that you want to run. Now, I think this is exciting. I think passes are super fun. And it's not a threat to us because as long as it could be automated with Terraform or IAC, like it still works with Massdriver. But the thing that's concerning about this is we aren't making enough ops people still. And AI is not catching up to ops at all. If anybody's like, wait, what the fuck do you mean by that? We don't train AI on ops. We train AI on really shitty Terraform code on Medium articles. We don't train it on production data. We don't train it on your traffic patterns. We don't train it on your architecture. We train it on snapshots of little pieces of configuration. So AI is not going to really help the general company. It might make an operations person more efficient, right? And so as we start to reach for these simpler systems, people going back to passes, maybe people using simpler things like Lightsail. I don't know if anybody actually uses it, but let's just pretend. Right? What I'm concerned with is what happens to security at that point in time, because a lot of these passes do not do private networking. They don't do peering, right? And you're starting to see these people reaching for simplicity. Big companies starting to use Vercel, huge companies starting to use Superbaits. These are both fantastic products. But when my backend traverses the public internet to go to a database as a service, and then I've got Redis as a service over here, and I've got Kafka as a service over here from 3 different companies, and I'm just constantly traversing the public internet, we're going to start seeing more breaches. We're going to start seeing more latency issues.
I think it's interesting. Like, to be honest, I'm not sure, how are we going to solve it? Because I agree with the problem. I don't know what will be the solution, but I agree that we're much like the complexity can't really like we can't go down this route. Like something need to change. Okay, I think with that we pretty much finished the episode, and we're like a bit behind schedule. Why should, or like how can I contact you or Massdriver? Should I go to the site? Is there a free trial? How can I, you won me over? How can I use you?
Yeah, I'm Cory O'Daniel, no E, pretty much everywhere. LinkedIn, GitHub, Twitter, etc. Massdriver is massdriver.cloud. We do have a free trial, so get on there, hop on it, play with it. And yeah, I mean, if you're a startup founder, like starting to fundraise and like need intros or want to like get somebody like look at your deck, like feel free to reach out. I got a ton of help getting to where Massdriver is today, so I like kind of pay that forward. So happy to chat about startup life. If you're somebody you're stuck with an ops problem, shoot me an email. I might know the answer. But yeah, Cory O'Daniel everywhere. I'm Cory at massdriver.cloud. And yeah, also you can find me at platformengineeringpod.com. So
maybe I will come as well, and then we'll do like the complete.
Heck yeah, full circle. Do it.
Yeah. So thanks a lot, Cory.
Yeah, good for having me.
Kubernetes for humans.